Furnace might have the biggest redemption arc in Clash Royale history, from being one of Supercell's most neglected cards to receiving both a rework and an evo on the same day, reaching a peak of 97% usage rate between both the evo Furnace and the regular Furnace. The rework itself was one of the most mechanically significant changes we've ever seen. For years, it was one of the most least used and least respected cards in the game. It rarely appeared in competitive play, and when it did, it was usually niche. A card that had spent years at the bottom of the meta was suddenly one of the most played cards in the game. So in this video, we're going to look at how Furnace went from one of the weakest and most forgotten cards in the game to one of the most oppressive cards in the entire meta, and whether it truly deserves to be considered one of the most broken cards ever. Before Furnace ever had an evolution, it has somewhat of a long history but mostly uneventful. Furnace was originally released in 2016 as a 5 elixir rare building that unlocked in Spell Valley. On paper, it fit right in with the other early spawner buildings like Goblin Hut and Barbarian Hut. Once placed, it would spawn 2 fire spirits every 10 seconds over a 50-second lifetime. That meant 6 total waves, or 12 fire spirits if left completely untouched. Furnace was also introduced at an interesting time in Clash Royale's history. By the time it released, spawner decks were already becoming one of the more controversial archetypes in the game. Goblin Hut and Barbarian Hut had established a reputation for slow and low effort pressure. Instead of building a traditional push, you could simply stack buildings and force the opponent to respond over time. Furnace became essentially the 3rd major spawner added to the game, and it reinforced that same playstyle. Unlike Tombstone, which serves a very clear defensive purpose and dies in one shot from the Princess Tower, Furnace had direct tower tripping potential. But this is where Furnace ended up in a strange position. If your Furnace was overleveled, it could feel extremely annoying. The fire spirits would require 2 hits from the tower to die, surviving just long enough to reach the tower. However, if it was underleveled, they would die in 1 hit. It would be extremely underwhelming, essentially serving a similar purpose as a Tombstone but at an extra elixir cost and without the death spawns. If we look at early usage data, Furnace briefly appeared on release at around 6% usage rate in top ladder. For most of its early lifespan, Furnace hovered near the bottom of both usage and win rate charts. It was rarely seen in grand challenges and almost non-existent in competitive play. When it did appear, it was usually in chip cycle decks, Lava Hound decks, and spawner decks. But even then, it was never the defining card of those archetypes. It shined when supporting a push, offering splash damage to help deal with swarm units, but it never truly filled the role of a defensive building like Tombstone, and it didn't provide the same consistent trip pressure as the Goblin Hut or Barbarian Hut. It just didn't have a clear identity. Throughout its lifetime, Furnace saw small buffs and small nerfs, the most notable one near the release of the card, reducing the elixir cost from 5 to 4, but the state of the card stayed pretty much the same. At this point, it was clear that minor stat adjustments weren't going to fix the underlying issue. It needed a new identity. That identity change finally came with the rework and new evo on August 4, 2025. Instead of functioning as a stationary building, Furnace was redesigned as a walking ranged troop. The new Furnace moved relatively slowly and also had a slow attack speed. On paper, those stats don't look impressive, but its ability to spawn fire spirits compensates for that. If placed in the back, it would spawn the same amount of waves as the old building version, providing the same amount of fire spirit value, but also having the flexibility of being an extra body to support a push. Despite this, its strength lies in its defensive ability. When holding a position against an incoming push, it could continuously spawn fire spirits while remaining stationary instead of marching towards the enemy tower to its death. The community response to the rework itself was mostly positive. While some players were frustrated about losing a traditional building slot in their decks, many agreed that the Furnace finally felt like it had a clear role. It was much more versatile, more interactive, and less dependent on level discrepancies. But this sentiment completely changed when people saw the strength of the evolved Furnace. The Furnace's evolution is unlocked with 6 evolution shards. When played, it spawns a Furnace with identical stats to the non-evo version. The key difference between the evo and non-evo version is that every time the evo Furnace attacks, it will spawn an additional fire spirit. At first glance, that doesn't sound dramatic. However, because the extra fire spirit was tied to attacks, the longer the evo Furnace survived, and on top of that the more often it attacked, the more value it generated. This created a new optimization strategy. Players began deliberately maximizing its attack uptime, placing it in positions where it would continuously attack while staying protected behind tanks. Rage became a natural synergy, increasing its attack speed and therefore increasing fire spirit generation. Many people compared it to a way better version of the Musketeer being the same cost, but having the extra utility to defend swarm units. It was ridiculously difficult to deal with when it was used as a defensive unit on the opponent's side of the arena. Within days of release, combined usage of regular Furnace and Evil Furnace peaked at 97%. That is an insane statistic. Even accounting for the fact that this includes both the regular and evolved versions, a combined 97 usage rate is extremely rare in Clash Royale. Players even began experimenting with Furnace cycle decks, built specifically to rotate back to the evolution as quickly as possible. When a card becomes the focal point of an entire cycle strategy, that's usually a sign that it's overtuned. What made the Evil Furnace especially strong wasn't that it was radically different from the Rework version, it was that it amplified everything the Rework had already improved. The community reaction was as expected. The combined usage rate of 97% immediately raised concerns. Players rushed to unlock the evolution, especially in ladder, aiming to get some free elo. The Evil Furnace even had a CWR of 65%, indicating the win rate of people using the card against those who don't use it. Being such an oppressive unit for the period after its release, many people were calling for nerfs ASAP. And so on August 7th, 3 days after its release, the Furnace received an emergency nerf, reducing its hit points by 19% and increased the spawn time for its fire spirits from 5 seconds to 7 seconds. Despite this, many players felt it was still strong. Discussions continued around additional nerfs, with some suggesting that it should lose certain survivability thresholds. The card still served as a great counter to certain units, and was an overall above average performing card. On October 6th, the Furnace was hit by another balance patch, this time increasing its movement speed from slow to medium. While that might sound like a buff, it effectively reduced the time it could stay away from the enemy side of the river, slightly lowering its defensive scaling potential. Today, Furnace sits in a much healthier position than it did at launch. Usage rates are significantly lower than their peak, and there are much more reliable counters available. It still sees play in certain archetypes, being more of a niche pick, but still a perfectly viable option. So, was Furnace actually the most broken evil of all time? To evaluate this, it helps to compare to other OP evolution cards that have been released. There are plenty of examples of cards that had OP evolutions, but two evolutions in particular mentioned frequently alongside the Furnace are the Evil Firecracker and the Evil Knight. Evil Firecracker is widely regarded as the most frustrating unit to face on release. Its evolved ability allowed projectiles to leave lingering damage puddles on impact, creating chip pressure through poison that was extremely annoying to deal with. It had an insane damage multiplier, pushback, and had enough HP to survive arrows. This was a huge pain point for many players, and forced them to use higher cost spells to counter her. Evil Knight on release was also very game-breaking. He had a massive shield that reduced incoming damage by 80% until he dealt damage. He was seen as the best defensive card and would counter anything. There was no shortcut to killing this unit, unlike the Firecracker where you could technically one-shot with a fireball. It's worth to note that neither of these cards matched the peak combined usage that the Evil Furnace achieved at launch. That level of usage is extremely rare, so in terms of raw usage dominance, Evil Furnace takes the cake. For years, Furnace struggled with identity and relevance. Then, almost overnight, it became one of the most played cards in Clash Royale history. Whether or not it was the single most broken evolution ever, its launch period was undeniably one of the most statistically extreme moments we've seen in the evolution era. And for a card that once had no identity at all, that's a pretty remarkable turnaround.